Okay, g'day everyone and welcome to lecture 3 for BMO 703. What we're going to talk about in this lecture is the concept of innovation strategy and entrepreneurial strategy. So when we talk about strategy, we're really talking about a plan of future action. We're talking about setting some objectives or some goals in terms of where we want to go, and then trying to identify a set of tactics or actions that we might take over a period of time that will enable us to achieve those objectives, to achieve those goals. And so what we're going to talk about in this lecture is specifically looking at the process of innovation and entrepreneurship and how these two processes can interface with the strategy process within an organisation. So some of these concepts of strategy you might have been exposed to before. If you've done strategic management, for example, you would have looked at the role and function of strategy. If you haven't, it's probably worth just grabbing any sort of introductory strategic management text and just having a quick read through of the opening chapter, which sort of deals with what is a strategy and why is it important. So today we're really looking at this notion of innovation and entrepreneurship strategy and talking about how the links that exist between innovation activity, entrepreneurial activity and the overall strategy and direction of the organisation. Up front, I'll probably say that the big difference with just general strategic management is looking at how we leverage our competitive advantage in the future within our existing context. So how do we compete effectively in our existing markets or industries? When we talk about innovation or entrepreneurship strategy, what we're talking about is how do we open up new markets or start up new businesses. Okay, so the real emphasis here is changing context rather than competing within the existing context that the organisation currently operates. And when we unpack the term innovation strategy, we'll look at it in terms of two main parts. We'll start off by looking at the overall notion of business strategy, what business strategy means and how it's informed by the concept of innovation and entrepreneurship. And then we'll look at an innovation and entrepreneurship strategy itself and look at what are the elements that make up that particular type of strategy. So what we're going to do here is talk about the linkages that exist between innovation, entrepreneurship and strategy. And really we're taking a big picture view here to try and understand how an understanding of entrepreneurship and innovation might influence the way an organisation positions itself in the market or relative to its overall competitive environment. When we talk about a strategy, what a strategy is all about is looking at the world around us, looking at the sort of competitive threats that we face, looking at the resources and capabilities that we possess as an organisation, and then trying to develop a strategy that helps to align us most effectively with that competitive environment. So the strategy helps to position us in the marketplace. And so it's really important from an organisational perspective that if we're going to innovate or if we're going to engage in entrepreneurial behaviour, that we try and develop a strategy that helps us to position the organisation differently in the market, in our current market, or that might position us in an alternate market. Remember that entrepreneurship is all about opportunity identification, and often those opportunities are in new or different markets from the markets which we currently compete. So it's trying to understand our market position relative to those contexts and factors. And what we're interested here is the set of innovation activities that comprise a new stream of organisational activity that must be considered in terms of the competitive advantage that they will potentially bring. So in a strategic context, what we're always trying to do is build and develop competitive advantage with our organisation. We're trying to identify what is our advantage relative to other organisations in the market. And so what we're trying to figure out here is how can we engage in innovative and entrepreneurial behaviours that lead to some sort of new advantage for the organisation. Again, whenever we talk about innovation or entrepreneurship, we're really focused on newness or being able to do something that's different from what we've previously done. And what we're really interested in here is how that newness will relate to our overall business or organisational strategy. So organisations already have a strategy in play. They're already doing particular things, and often businesses have multiple business units. They're not just competing in one industry, they're often competing in multiple industries. So for example, if you think about Apple is competing not just in the phone marketplace, but it's also competing in things like the computer marketplace, the ITV marketplace. So there's a lot of different segments that it's actually competing in. And so any innovation activity, any entrepreneurial strategy that they develop has to relate to that overall business or organisational strategy. It's got to help reinforce the positioning of that organisation in the market and ensure the viability of the business going forward. So it's really important we understand how these innovation and entrepreneurship activities relate to that overall business strategy. So innovation and entrepreneurship certainly have an important role to play within that overall business strategy, within the overall context of the organisation. And an organisation can be said to have a strategy, but that strategy can be very different and mean very different things. Okay, so we've got to understand what is it the organisation's strategy actually is. What are we trying to do? So later in this lecture we'll actually talk about a couple of different models of strategy that say we can think about our strategic focus in different ways. So for example, we'll look at Michael Porter's model, and Porter says that an organisation can pursue either a differentiation strategy or a low-cost strategy, or some combination of those two to achieve some sort of competitive advantage. It might choose also to focus, so it might do a focus low-cost or a focus differentiation strategy. So we've got to understand what is the overall strategic position of the organisation, what is the organisation trying to achieve, and how do these innovative and entrepreneurial activities link into what we're trying to do. Now, strategy is very much a way that the organisation carves out a meaningful position for itself in the marketplace. Okay, so our strategy really defines how we're going to relate to market conditions. It relates to how we're going to identify our niche or the areas within that market that we're going to service. And a strategy really tells us, importantly, how we're going to relate to the customer. From a marketing and an entrepreneurship perspective, strategy really should tell us a lot about how we're going to position and how we're going to create value for our customers. So it's really important for us to understand how any entrepreneurial strategy might create new value for the customers. What additional value are we able to provide? And one of the ways we can do that or understand where we might create value is by looking at undertaking some sort of value chain analysis. So the value chain model, which has been around for quite some time, says that any organisation is a series of value creating activities. And what we need to do is understand where value is created in that chain. Okay, so where do we create value, or where is value lost? Where do we actually destroy value because we don't have good organisational processes and policies in place? And then understanding where we have the capabilities and resources that are needed to operate that chain effectively. Okay, so again, any entrepreneurial activity we undertake really should be linked to creating new value in that value chain. And it's very important to understand that strategy is really all about the future. Okay, this is probably one of the biggest challenges we face in strategizing, is we're not talking about what we should do here and now. We're talking about what we should do in the next 2 or 5 or 10 years. Okay, and so part of what we're doing when we're strategizing is we're setting objectives. We're saying, as an organisation, overall, this is the strategic objective we would like to achieve. This is where we would like to be in the future as an organisation. Okay, so we set the objective. And then we have to deploy or use our resources in such a way that maximises our likelihood of achieving those objectives. Now, organisations don't operate in a vacuum. So there's going to be lots of external and internal forces that are going to get in the way and limit our ability to achieve those objectives. There might also be forces that actually facilitate our achievement of those objectives. The point is, we can't do it on our own. It's also important to remember that organisations have very limited resources, okay? And those resource constraints, those resource limits, really constrain the type of strategies we can actually undertake. And again, for those of you who've done strategic management, you would have talked about concepts like path dependence, for example, that the resources we have sort of dictate what we're able to do now and into the future. And it's not easy for us to change our resources and capabilities to enable us to do new things. And so again, innovation is facilitated by our resources, but it can also be constrained by the resources we have as an organisation. So when we're thinking about what defines something as strategic as opposed to tactical or operational, we need to be really clear about what it is we're talking about. How are we defining a strategy within an organisation? So when we talk about something being strategic, what we know is that strategic matters tend to be much more high stake. Okay, so the payoff from strategic actions tends to be far greater than tactical actions. Also, the potential losses or costs associated with those are also much higher stake. And so because strategic matters involve such high stakes, a lot more thought goes into developing what we're going to do strategically. We know that strategic decisions are relatively long-lasting because they're about achieving future objectives. Okay, so they tend to be very broad and they tend to be driven by what the future might be for the organisation. And strategy involves making substantial commitments of resources. And we're talking here about all the resources that the organisation possesses. And organisations are often faced with very difficult and competing choices about what they should or could do with those limited resources. And so part of our strategic thinking is thinking about how is the best way to deploy these resources. And from an entrepreneurial perspective, what we're trying to do is think of a new or different way that we might be able to combine those resources to achieve some different outcome. And we also know that strategic initiatives tend to involve some form of significant change to the organisation. Okay, so they're not minor activities again, they're very major things that the organisation is engaging in over a period of time. So we sort of set the scene and talked a little bit about what we mean by entrepreneurial strategy and why it's important. What I want to talk about now in this next small section is talk a little bit about the different approaches that we might see to strategy.